Prince Andrew, Sex Reigns. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. The new biography, written by Andrew Lowney, is providing a range of disclosures about Prince Andrew. Meticulously researched over 4 years, the publication brings to the fore information that people had an awareness of, and fresh information delving deep into the life of Prince Andrew. This additional information has enabled me to demonstrate once again the narcissism of Prince Andrew. I don't know if the publication makes reference to narcissism in respect of Andrew, possibly not. It might be the case that the author is aware that he's a narcissist but doesn't want to say as such, or might be unaware as to what really drives Andrew's behaviour. And one might lean towards the latter as a consequence of the information that I'm going to share with you. What it demonstrates is a key aspect of the behaviour of Prince Andrew, which is clearly driven by his narcissism, but it would appear that many people don't realise that, and therefore seek to explain his behaviour as something else. Excerpts, of course, have been provided, and, as per a report in the Daily Telegraph from Hannah Furness, the Duke of York lost his virginity at the age of 11, a new biography has alleged. Now, there's no suggestion that this was a consequence of him being abused. Of course, it might be argued that for that to take place when he was that age, even if he consented, there'd be some individuals that still would regard that as a form of abuse. But it doesn't appear to be that that is what is being stated, but rather that Andrew's sexual prowess began at a particularly early age. Now, just because somebody is subjected to or has chosen sexual enterprise at a young age doesn't naturally make them a narcissist. But knowing what we know about his range of behaviours, which have established his narcissism, it's no surprise to learn that with regard to this particular narcissist, he is, for want of a better description, sex-obsessed. Many people would just think to themselves, he's absolutely sex-obsessed. That's what drives his behaviour. But sex is just the manifestation of his narcissism. As an upper-lesser type A somatic narcissist, his narcissism has chosen sex as a means to get him to destination prime aims. By using sex, he can control people, he can draw fuel, he can gain the residual benefits. And, as a consequence of an absence of boundary recognition, a sense of entitlement, the driving force of his narcissism caused him to purportedly lose his virginity at the age of 11. The book also states that he had multiple sexual experiences before he turned 13. The experiences detailed in a new biography of the Duke and his ex-wife by Andrew Lowney are said to have proved a formative moment in which the young Prince Andrew realised that he was obsessed with women. It may well be correct that he realised that he had an obsession with women, but he won't have known why that was. Presumably, he just thought, I really enjoy sex, it's great. After all, it is a pleasurable experience for many people, not only a case of getting their rocks off, but for others also a form of intimacy, a closeness, an importance in their relationship. For others, it's more about the physical act in itself and the pleasure that is felt whilst having sex and the ultimate orgasm where that's obtained. But for Andrew, he will not have realised that it was his narcissism that was driving his behaviour. He would have simply thought, I really enjoy sex. Women, great. And therefore understood that he was obsessed with them. One source quoted in the book suggested that the early sexual encounters might be the root of Andrew's problems, and the author said it perhaps explains some of the behaviour later on. And this is where one suspects that they aren't aware that it was his narcissism that was actually the root of his problems, not the early sexual encounters. They appear to be suggesting that because he was exposed to early sexual encounters, this framed his behaviour when he became a man. In actual fact, it's his narcissism that not only caused him to have those early sexual encounters, but it's his narcissism which also framed his behaviour at a later stage. Quite simply, Prince Andrew's narcissism recognises that sex is the most effective, hugely effective way for him to go after control, fuel, and residual benefits. Therefore, it galvanises him with hypersexualization, a high sex drive that necessitates him pursuing women for the purposes of having sex with them. Another source, who knows the Duke, told the Telegraph they were aware of Prince Andrew previously alluding to sexual experiences at what most of us would consider as too young an age, and said his personal life has been far more complex than the public knew. The book, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York, details Prince Andrew's finances and sex life as an adult, along with his connection to Jeffrey Epstein. The 456 pages are described by the author as a tale of childhood trauma, infidelity, lust, betrayal, corruption, greed, extravagance, arrogance, entitlement, establishment cover-up, and hubris. Much of that, of course, is what's thrown into the cauldron of narcissism. Childhood trauma equates to a lack of control environment. Infidelity is found with the narcissist. Lust is a driving force for the narcissist. Betrayal is a lack of emotional empathy and an absence of accountability. Corruption, a sense of entitlement. Greed, a sense of entitlement. Extravagance, grandiosity. Arrogance, a haughty behaviour. Entitlement speaks for itself. Hubris, grandiosity. Thus, other than the establishment cover-up, all of those aspects are things that you would find with a narcissist. Under a subheading of Randy Andy, the Duke's nickname in the tabloid press for tales of his adult love life, the book quotes an unnamed source as saying that his early sexual activity explains why he spent most of his adult life at high risk of self-abuse, depression, and risky sexual encounters. No, it's his narcissism that generated his early sexual activity and which has then segued into continued hypersexualization as an adult. The book reads, according to a source close to Andrew, he had his first sexual experience aged 8 and lost his virginity at 11. Now, the excerpt doesn't tell us the circumstances of that, and it remains to be seen whether the book does. But the impression that is given isn't that he was on the receiving end of abusive behaviours, but rather, even at that young age, he was driven to early sexual encounters. I know from my own perspective, it was similar for myself with regard to the use of sex as a means to control, to draw fuel, to seek stimulation. I too had early sexual experiences. But this isn't about me, it's about Prince Andrew, and I'll detail on another occasion what I experienced and how that was driven by my narcissism and my psychopathy. The book goes on to claim, through the same source, Andrew admitted that his second sexual experience came before he turned 12, and when he was 13, he had already slept with more than half a dozen girls. Again, the source states, I believe this might be the root of Andrew's problems. No, it's his narcissism that's the root of his problems. It's the narcissism that drove him to have such an early sexual experience. It caused him to lose his virginity aged 11, that he had another sexual experience before he turned 12, and that by the time he was 13, he'd already slept with more than half a dozen girls. Now, it'd be interesting to find out the circumstances of all of this and whether members of the family had any awareness of what was going on. The Duke's team did not respond to the claims when approached by the Telegraph, nor did Buckingham Palace, which no longer officially represents the Duke of York. When asked about the claims, a source who knows the Duke said he has previously alluded to sexual experiences at what most of us would consider as too young an age. Poor chap. The Duke's personal story is far more complex than people realise or have ever been prepared to properly consider. Lowney said that he had included the claim in the book because it seemed to me it was part of building a picture of behaviour and how it shaped his life. Or rather, it certainly does build a picture of behaviour, and it shows how his life was shaped by the driving force behind this behaviour. Lowney also added, it does perhaps explain some of the behaviour later on. I think Andrew in some ways has been a victim. It does make him much more sympathetic in a way. Now, we don't know whether he was the victim of sexual behaviour or that he was indeed the instigator of it, which is the impression that I gain from what has been written in respect of the excerpts. And it is interesting, of course, to see that how sex formed a part of his behaviour at a young age, and it's clear that this is the somatic narcissism at work, that he earned that title of Randy Andy because basically he was like a dog with 6 dicks. His narcissism drove him to have early sexual experiences, to pursue women, and he did so in a rather ham-fisted fashion, as I've explained in parts passim. But nevertheless, it was sex and more sex, that was the conduit to get him to the prime aims. And the fact that he had sex at such a young age isn't something that's necessarily the case with all narcissists, but it is more prevalent amongst narcissists than the general population as a consequence of that rising hypersexuality and the way that even with a child, sex can be utilised by that child with regard to interactions, possibly with adults, but more usually with other children, in order to assert control, to draw fuel, to gain those residual benefits. Sex is hugely important for somatic narcissists, and it shows in relation to Andrew, it was the single most important factor for him, and the conduit that his narcissism got hold of to drive him to behave in the way that he did. This publication looks at it in a more sympathetic way, believing that he'd had early sexual encounters and that has somehow led to an unhealthy approach to sex as he's been older. It could be that he might have been on the receiving end of abuse, but we have no evidence of that, and instead it's likely an alternative lack of control environment combined with the genetic predisposition created his narcissism, and his narcissism then selected sex, and more sex, and even more sex, because sex reigns. That was the way that it would be in terms of his narcissism getting what was required. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.